Okay, hi everybody. I'd like to introduce the next panel, the future of clinical trials in spinal cord injury. My name is Joe Pantginis. I'm the head of research and managing director of equity research at H.C. Wainwright. Also, for full disclosure, I do cover lineage cell, and it's also been very exciting and also, slow at the same time to have been following the OPC1 story since before the IND was filed at Geron at the day. So it's been nice to see the data and the progress that's being made, and we're looking forward to the next steps coming up for the company. So let me lay out how this is going to happen today. It's going to be a little bit of a hybrid panel, if you will. We're going to talk about clinical endpoints, and we're going to talk about epidemiology of stem cells, and we're going to have the two very distinguished panelists who I feel need no introduction, but I'm going to still give it my best shot before we get into what I think is going to be a very fruitful discussion. So first, Dr. MJ Mulcahey will be talking about endpoints, and I think both Jared and Jake over here gave a very, very good introduction to MJ's talk with regard to what you're wanting to see from clinical trials and what's measured and what's not measured and what's actually real and helpful. So I really appreciate that feedback earlier. Dr. Mulcahey is a professor of occupational therapy and director of the Center of Outcomes and Measurement at Jefferson College of Rehabilitation Sciences at Thomas Jefferson University, She also holds secondary appointment in rehabilitation medicine in the Sidney Kimmel Medical College of Thomas Jefferson. She has over 30 years of experience as an occupational therapy practitioner, educator, and researcher. She served as principal investigator for a seminal multi-center study on the international standards for neurological classification of spinal cord injury, which subsequently led to guidance and guidelines on evaluation of the neurological consequence of SCI in children, and the first study aimed at establishing imaging biomarkers of pediatric SCI. Dr. Mulcahey has conducted studies that established lower age recommendation guidelines for the NINDS, SCI CDEs, and international stem cell injury basic data sets. She's developed and validated estimates to allow linking between pediatric and adult spinal cord injury patient reported outcomes, and MJ serves as co-investigator on several studies aimed to develop neuroimaging biomarkers for SCI, and is developing a spinal cord injury clinical trial outcome assessment using contemporary measurement methodologies. She's the past president and fellow of the American Spinal Injury Association, chair of the Board of Trustees of the American Occupational Therapy Foundation, and chair of the Board of Directors of the Steel Assembly for Pediatric Spinal Cord Injury. She is the 2021 recipient of the Association of SCI Professionals Komar Memorial Award for Distinguished Service to the Field of Spinal Cord Injury, and the 2022 American Spinal Injury Association Lifetime Achievement Award. Has received over $10 million in research awards, published over 200 peer-reviewed manuscripts, 25 book chapters, and 2 books. So please join me in welcoming MJ.
Thank you for the introduction. I am going to be talking about endpoints in clinical trials, and Jared and Jake, thank you very much because you did do an amazing job on setting this talk up. But, just full disclosure, there are 156 outcome measures listed on the NINDS spinal cord injury CD website, meaning we have about 156 outcome measures that are recommended for use in clinical trials, none of which are approved by the FDA. And so we could spend 3 days going through these clinical trial outcome measures, but what I'm going to do is just illustrate some of the challenges and opportunities we have using 2 that are most commonly used, and then talk a little bit about new directions. I think we would all agree that the key to understanding the impact of research on endpoints is the availability of valid, precise, and low-burden outcome measures, regardless of the type of measure we're using. So Jared and Jake did a great job talking about some of the limitations of patient-reported outcomes, but regardless, we need precise, valid, and low-burden. And I think it was Jake who talked about the INSCI, or the International Standards for Neurological Classification of Spinal Cord Injury, being the primary outcome that was used in the study he was involved in. And real briefly, for those who don't know, this examination requires testing of muscle strength at 20 muscle groups in the body, testing for sensation to light touch and the discrimination between pinprick and soft touch at 56 different locations in the body, and then the test for sacral sparing, which is done through a digital rectal examination. From those scores on the examinations, we can classify the level of injury, including neurological level, motor level, and sensory level, and we could also categorize the severity of injury, and Jake and Jep talked about their levels. So we have complete, which is an AIS-A, sensory incomplete, B, weak motor incomplete, C, and a strong motor incomplete, D. So what's important to know about this, the INSCIs, the standards, it was never developed or validated as a clinical trial outcome assessment. It was actually developed to facilitate a common language across the globe to talk about what the neurological consequence of spinal cord injury is. But through the years, we have repurposed it in our field to act as a criteria for entry into clinical trials, as well as to measure some primary endpoints. When we repurpose, we talked about repurposing drugs earlier, when we repurpose outcome measures, we have to be very careful about some of the limitations. And so let me just illustrate. This is a video of 3 individuals with C4 neurological level according to the INSCI. The woman at the top has C4 AIS-A, complete injury. The woman to your left has AIS-C, weak motor incomplete, and the woman to your right has C4 AIS, strong, D. Okay, and so within the C4 neurological level, you can see the variability in people. Okay, now we could say, well, that's okay because we have the AIS to classify severity of injury. So what I'd like to show here is, here are different neurological levels of injury, all within the AIS-C classification. So to your left is an individual with a C7 neurological level, and to your right has a C5 neurological level. And like Jake and Jarek was telling us, they have very different functions, even though they're one level apart. It could really, I don't know if this works, but it could really be illustrated in the individual C5 who's using a compensatory pattern without any grasping ability to pick up the spoon. Now, the previous video, one of the women was walking, and her neurological level was C4, and she also has an AIS-C classification. So here you have somebody with a higher level injury, AIS-C, walking, and C5 and C7 AIS-C unable to walk. And so I hope that these videos simply demonstrate that we have tremendous variability in the population with spinal cord injury. And again, thank you for bringing up the point. You know, Jake and Jeff talked about outcome assessments being tailored to individuals because of that variability. But historically, we have used the same exact exam to test or evaluate all of these people with spinal cord injuries regardless of their ability level. And that doesn't make sense, right? So how have we gotten here? And I'm just going to step back and talk about our traditional ways that we have developed outcome assessments. And the majority of the outcome assessments used in clinical trials were developed this way. So in this example, is this? Yeah, perfect. So let's just, for the sake of conversation, say we want to measure lower extremity function as a measurement construct or an endpoint in a clinical trial. All of us in the room who are physicians and OTs and PTs, we decided traditionally what items are relevant to lower extremity function, okay? And so we have an item pool. And then again, we physicians and OTs and PTs, we decided which of those items were easiest and which were hardest. We didn't invite people with spinal cord injuries to inform that conversation. We decided that on our own. And this is really the classical test theory and the traditional ways we made tests. And the problem is that we have very, very weak assumptions around these tests. So first, they're an ordinal scale, so we don't know the difference between each response category. So is the difference between hard and very hard the same as very hard and unable to do? So we don't know that, and we also don't know the difficulty of the items in relationship to each other, okay? We also are making assumptions that the items are in fact linear, so we want linear measures to make sense and to reduce measurement error. And we're making a big assumption that the order is accurate because just the experts in healthcare decided what that order is. Importantly, as a measurement geek, we talk about this concept of unidimensionality. We want our outcome assessments to measure one thing, in this case, lower extremity function. But we are assuming that all those items measure lower extremity function. So that's some of the problems with our outcome measures. This is the one outcome measure that is most frequently used in clinical trials for spinal cord injury, the Spinal Cord Injury Independence Measure. It was introduced in 1997. The measurement construct is physical functioning, and it was developed using the traditional approach where experts in the field, not people with lived experiences, developed all these items. Hopefully, I just introduced the word unidimensionality, we could appreciate that this scale is multidimensionality, and we've shown that using statistical modeling. So in most clinical samples, the SCIM is either a 3 or a 4-dimension scale, meaning it's measuring 3 or 4 different things. So self-care, mobility, bowel and bladder. And so when you have a scale that's measuring 3 different concepts, it's not linear, precision goes down, measurement error goes up, okay? But this is the most commonly used clinical outcome assessment in spinal cord injury. So because we have done some statistical modeling and now understand that this is unidimensional, what we now use as endpoints is, as an example, the subscale of self-care, okay? So let's just take a look at the, this is the SCIM self-care subscale, okay? That's what we use usually now in clinical trials, and let me orient you to this slide. This is a linear scale in logits, okay? Interval level, not ordinal, so we know the difference between each cut point, if you will. These hashtags and dots are people's ability from less able to more able, and the people are from this sample of 425 people with spinal cord injury. And then on this side are the SCIM items from easiest to most difficult. And so what does this right map that, again, we use through statistical modeling show us or inform us about the self-care SCIM subscale? Well, here we see in this sample, 425 people, SCIM items range in difficulty from -4, easiest, which is eating, to most difficult, dressing lower extremity, okay, +3. However, this sample, 425 people, their ability range in difficulty from -6 to +5. And so what? Well, so what is we have no SCIM self-care items that have the ability to evaluate people's ability at the lowest end or the highest end. And so we call the ceiling and floor effects, and most of us, know what that means. What's interesting here, though, is, again, as a measurement geek, we have gaps in content, all right? So we go from this item of the SCIM, jump up to here, but look at all the people's ability here where we don't have any item to measure. So what's the cost? If you use this in a clinical trial with people with lower levels of ability, and if they're starting here and they get up to here, you may not be able to evaluate that improvement. Most people up here will ceiling out, and so even if they do improve, we have no more items up here to evaluate their ability. And then importantly, people who are functioning here, as an example, if they maybe are functioning here at baseline and they jump here, we have a gap in content, so we didn't evaluate their ability. And so understanding the measurement properties of the scales we use is really important to the interpretation of our results, because it would be a shame to see people improve from here to here and say that our therapeutic had no effect, when in fact maybe it did, but we didn't have items to evaluate that effect. So the other thing about the spinal cord injury, and I'm onto this repurposing because, you know, in measurement we have to be careful about repurposing. The SCIM was developed as a performance-based measure, meaning you have a skilled rater, usually a therapist, observe the participant perform, and the rater scores the performance on a standardized scale. We have repurposed the SCIM to a self-report. And that's a good thing because we want to reduce the burden of people coming back to the clinic to get the data, and it seems to be lower burden. However, when we repurpose a performance-based measure as a self-report, we have some limitations. So what's the risk? And Jake and Jared told us some of the risks about patient-reported outcomes, how, you know, people may be responding inaccurately, but there's other risks. If you don't develop it from the start, there's standard methodologies on how to develop and test good questions before you release them into the field. So one question, and we did cognitive testing where we dove into how people respond. How difficult is it to walk across the street? And here's the response scale. And we asked people with cervical level injuries and people with thoracic injuries and people who walk to talk about how they would respond. One person with a C5 level injury who did not walk said, "It's easy because I don't do it." Whereas another one at the same level said, "I cannot do it, I don't walk." Okay? If this was developed as a patient-reported outcome as the start, we would have captured this and we would have designed the test question differently. Likewise, in this slide really illustrates and hits home what Jake and Jarek was talking about. How difficult is it to reach? Again, same response scale. This person at high-level tetraplegia, easy. Well, it is easy for her, but appreciate she's hooking here to maintain her balance. She's externally rotating her arm and locking her elbow to reach. You know, there's no movement in there. She's compensating or cheating, as you introduce the word. And we talk about cheating all the time in therapy. We will ask, well, are you cheating when you bring your head over, or are you really using your triceps? And the people with spinal cord injury, they'll tell you, I'm cheating a little bit. But the problem comes home when we're using this as an outcome measure to assess our clinical trials. You know, how difficult is it to brush your teeth, write, drink, and eat? And again, to Jake's and Jarrett's point, the compensation that people with spinal cord injury do is amazing. They compensate and they cheat all the time, and they will say, these activities, pretty easy, but appreciate how they're doing it. And so in addition to some of the problems that Jake and Jared talked about, patient-reported outcomes usually really don't care how people do it. They care about how people are functioning in everyday life. Physical functioning, not recovery of movement, but recovery of the functional abilities in meaningful activities, everyday life. And so one has to say, you know, if we are very excited about our devices and our drugs that are coming out for recovery of movement or restoration of neurological functioning, not physical functioning, we have to define our terminology, we care about how people move if we're saying that our therapeutic is targeting the central nervous system to recover movement. We care and we have to measure it. And right now, we don't have any performance-based outcome assessment that accounts for compensatory patterns. And so even if we're observing people in the clinic, we don't have a way to document or rate their compensatory strategies. And this, I believe, is a problem in our measurement and maybe mitigating some of the advancements as we talk about impact of our therapeutics. So I'm going to go through the contemporary or the modern approach to now create these measurement tools, because with the era of computing and new statistical models, we're able to manage data much better. And so now how many, like the PROMIS measures, many patient-reported outcomes are developed using contemporary measurements. So here we have the same exact item pool that we think measures lower extremity function. Instead of all of the physicians and OTs and PTs in the room that decide what order they are in terms of simple to difficult, we're actually going to administer it to over 1,000 people with spinal cord injury. And the data are going to tell us actually how the items scale. okay? So there's no more guessing here. And this is using item response theory, or the contemporary approach to measurement, and the assumptions are really strong when we use this approach. We're now on an interval level scale. So we jumped from ordinal to an interval level scale where the quantifiable differences are known. Really, really important. We also, through this calibration study, which refers to the study that administers it to 1,000 people with SCI, confirms all our assumptions. So yes, the items are linear, and yes, they are in the correct order from easiest to difficult, the data tell us, but it also confirms the unidimensionality. So as an example, in this hypothetical study of 1,000 people, maybe the data said rollerblade and crossing legs are not hanging with the other items. They're misfitting. They don't measure lower extremity function. They're measuring something else, so we throw them out. All right, we deal with the measurement error up front. And they also, the data can tell us which items are redundant. So as an example, the data may say the items of skip and jump tell us exactly the same information in terms of difficulty and the ability to discriminate among people. And so we could throw one of them out to reduce the burden of the test. And this is the contemporary way we're developing measures. So have we used this for spinal cord injury? Again, this is the method that's used in the PROMIS measures, which are a very common patient-reported outcome measures, generic ones. But yes, we have used this exact method to develop the spinal cord injury functional index measure. This is a patient-reported outcome that developed items around physical functioning, administered it to 855 people with spinal cord injury, ran the statistical modeling, and ended up with 6 calibrated item banks, linear item banks, all unidimensional. So some of you may be saying, well, so what do we do with a calibrated item bank? How do we move that into a clinical outcome assessment? Computer adaptive tests function on the basis of a calibrated item bank. And so in computer adaptive testing, the best analogy is if you have high school students who are taking SATs to get into college, the math test is all on a CAT, a computer adaptive test, where we would all get the same first question, math question. Those who get it correct will have more difficult questions. Those who get it incorrect will have less difficult math questions. And the computer drops items based on the responses to previous questions, and so that it estimates people's ability until they have a score. What's nice about this, if I got all the low question math questions because I'm not good at math, and somebody else gets really hard questions, in the end, because the questions are all pulled from the same calibrated item bank, the scores can be pooled and compared. And that's pretty powerful. And this CAT speaks to what Jake and Jared said, is that the test should be tailored to our abilities or where we are. And so you could say that the woman that we saw in the video with C4 AIS, she would be getting items down here, but they would be estimating her ability. We would have items that would estimate her ability. And the woman with C4 AISD, she would be getting items up here. Different items, they're all getting different items, but in the end, we could pool their scores. And so it's a very powerful tool. And so what we're, the question is, if IRT or these advanced models can be used to develop robust and precise patient-reported outcomes, why not do the same for performance-based measures of a measurement construct that we need to measure in efficacy studies that are using therapeutics to target the nervous system, right? Recovery of movement, not recovery of function, because years after injury, people continue to recover function because they get smarter in their compensatory strategies. In our therapeutics that target the nervous system, we're interested in recovery of movement. And so we are, in fact, developing the spinal cord injury movement index. We're using item response theory, and we're going to go through the whole process. And the goal would be to have this linear interval scale, accounts for compensations. We could administer this across ability levels and across the continuum of injury. So that's the vision. The closing comments is this. Again, just to hit home that efficacy studies, we need precise outcome assessments, and we have the abilities, we have the models to do it. And so I would argue we really need to do it. We need to accelerate SCI biomarkers to better classify injury. I think the INSCI is really good. It serves a purpose, never developed as a way to really categorize injury for clinical trials. Meaningful change, we have to have change that's meaningful to people living with spinal cord injury. We learned very astutely by our pros over there that one size doesn't fit all. So what's meaningful one is not going to be meaningful perhaps to the next one. And we talked a little bit, and Jake and Jared, thank you very much, about these constructs of quality of life, well-being, life satisfaction, happiness. I think we need to ask ourselves, are we expecting too much from our therapeutic? Because quality of life is a big deal, and it changes all the time. And so, sometimes I think we need to step back and understand that a little that maybe we're in our space can be a lot, and those big deal things like quality of life are incredibly important, but informed and influenced by so many other things than our therapeutic. And so, again, to set up our trials for success. And that's all I have.
So thanks for that, MJ. And, really looking forward to our discussion where we could talk about how we're going to get some of these things into action and look forward into potential approvals. So with that said, I think we're going to switch to a little more of the earlier end of the trenches, if you will, to the neurosurgery part. So I think it's, going to be very exciting to link the two in our discussions in a few moments. But with that said, my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Fehlings. Dr. Fehlings is the Vice Chair of Research for the Department of Surgery at the University of Toronto and a neurosurgeon at Toronto Western Hospital University Health Network. Dr. Fehlings is a professor of neurosurgery at the University of Toronto, holds the Robert Campeau Family Foundation, Dr. C.H. Tater Chair in Brain and Spinal Cord Research at UHN, Senior Scientist at the Krembil Brain Institute and McLaughlin Scholar in Molecular Medicine. In the fall of 2008, Dr. Fehlings was appointed the inaugural director of the University of Toronto Spine Program. Dr. Fehlings combines an active clinical practice in complex spinal surgery with a translationally oriented research program focused on discovering novel treatments to improve functional outcomes following SCI. He has published over 1,050 peer-reviewed articles, chiefly in the area of central nervous system injury and complex spinal surgery. His seminal 1991 paper, cited over 2,000 times, outlined the severe and lasting consequence of SCI due to a cascade of secondary injury mechanisms following the initial trauma. His research on secondary injury mechanisms ultimately led to the commencement of the multi-center international surgical timing in acute spinal cord injury, or the STATSIS, aimed at establishing the need for early surgical decompression to prevent the negative effects of the secondary injury cascade. His work examining the use of regenerative approaches, including neural stem cells to repair the injured nervous system, has led to numerous international awards and has helped lead the field toward clinical translation in this area. Dr. Fehlings has published in prominent journals such as Nature, Nature Neuroscience, Lancet Neurology, and Science Translational Medicine, and has received a wider range of prestigious awards that include, and I can't list them all because we'll be here for quite a long time, the Gold Medal in Surgery from the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons, the Lister Award in Surgical Research, the Olive Koroma Award, which is the top award internationally for neurosurgeons and neuroscientists, award by the Nobel Institute at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm for his contributions in the CNS injury repair and regeneration space. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Fehlings, and we look forward to our discussions in a bit.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I really want to congratulate Lineage and the Reeve Foundation for putting this together, and I've been learning a lot and interacting a lot, and I really enjoyed MJ's talk as well, some exciting developments. So one of the big challenges that we have in trying to translate discoveries relates to kind of relating animal models where we have one species of animal, we have one model of injury, we precisely control all this heterogeneity, and then we go into the clinic and we've got a lot of heterogeneity. And then how do we deal with this? And then how do we design clinical trials, and how do we look at outcomes? So by way of disclosure, I guess I have two sets of disclosures. So one is that I've also spun off a company. We're interested in engineered neural stem cells. That's one element of it. And then the other element of this, which I'll kind of touch on a little bit in this talk, is that we've developed advanced algorithms to try to deal with the heterogeneity of clinical presentation, outcome predictions, and trial design. And that I've been an investigator on a number of clinical trials, which is, I guess, why I'm here. So this is kind of what we deal with, in the clinic. And every individual with a spinal cord injury, of course, is different. MJ nicely kind of showed some of that variability, but this is kind of what we're looking at. So here we have an individual who has a thoracic spinal cord injury. Then there's an individual who has a fracture dislocation from a diving-related injury. Then we've got an individual on the right, and this is part of the shifting demographic of what we're seeing, and this is what's called a traumatic central cord injury. So this person doesn't even have a fracture, and this person had a very low velocity fall. It's called a central cord injury in the setting of degenerative cervical arthritis and low velocity types of injuries. So this is our article from Lancet Neurology talking about the shifting demographics in neurotrauma in the world. And, we thought at one time that, we might even be able to almost eliminate a spinal cord injury from our society because of the prevention efforts. And we live in a much safer society. But the incidence has remained stable and, in fact, has slightly increased over the last 10 years. So why is that? Well, patients are getting older, and there's more fall mechanisms, and we have more cervical injuries. So currently, about 70% of injuries in North America are cervical, and most are due to central cord injuries. So most are this type of injury on the right side. And so the way we think about these injuries and the way we measure these injuries is really important. And MJ alluded to some of the challenges with the so-called Age or INSCI standards, and these were never really even designed to measure kind of the outcomes on the right. So that's kind of one of the challenges. So let's just kind of reflect on where we've come from, and there have been some landmark studies that have been done, and I think there's a few elements that we need to consider, but we also need to calibrate this. And this is probably the most cited clinical trial in spinal cord injury. And this is Bracken's study, published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1990. And this is with methylprednisolone. The primary outcome measure was actually negative, and they reported a secondary outcome to great splash. And probably nowadays this would have been reported as a negative clinical trial. And we can perhaps talk about that. And the trial was criticized for small effect sizes, and there was a high degree of heterogeneity. And I think that also kind of merits some discussions, because how much of an improvement is important? And I would actually argue that small effects matter. And I also would argue that we probably need to embrace the heterogeneity and not criticize it. And we probably need to have algorithms to deal with this heterogeneity, and we have to be careful that we not limit clinical trial enrollment to such a narrow bandwidth that A, it becomes almost impossible to enroll patients, and B, the generalizability then becomes low. So we need to really think about that. So this is the SCI study, and this was reported about a decade later, and this is also a landmark study, and the authors of SCI, in particular Fred Geisler, are to be commended for sharing the data. And a lot of the inferences that have occurred, including some of my own work, have benefited from this. This is one of the figures from their study, and you can see the wide heterogeneity in the ASIA scores that arise here. And so that becomes quite challenging. And this trial was reported as a negative trial, but they also had positive signal in the trial, and this was interpreted as negative, and I'm not sure it was really negative. I think that there was signal there. And this is what we learn in medical school and neurology and neurosurgery residencies around the traditional classification of incomplete spinal cord injury, and these certainly are very valid. But these syndromes, central cord syndrome, anterior cord syndrome, Brown-Séquard, posterior cord syndrome, they don't even begin to truly assess the heterogeneity and the complexity of an incomplete spinal cord injury. And this is, to some degree, commented upon in this classic article in the literature, kind of talking about the clinical features and the pathoanatomy of incomplete spinal cord injury and incomplete traumatic tetraplegia. So what about outcomes? And then, how do we consider outcomes? And I think one of the things that I've always found puzzling is that if we look at registries, so I'm an investigator in the North American Clinical Trials Network, which has been supported by the Reeve Foundation and U.S. Department of Defense grant funding. So typically when a patient comes in, we record about 252 clinical variables. And then when we measure the outcomes, we try to correlate everything with the INSCI or the ASIA scores. And that doesn't really make sense, right, when you think about that. But we do that. And as MJ has pointed out, the INSCI wasn't even designed to be used in this way. So what we have been doing is trying to address some of this complexity by using kind of big data approaches. And so we've been fortunate to be able to get access to the original trial data from Bracken, the SCI trial data, and then also the Staskas trial that I led, and then the North American Clinical Trials Network Registry. And so we've been able to put together a large data set that's now approaching around 3,000 patients. And I'll focus here on the cervical incomplete picture, and we could have kind of similar types of discussions for other types of injuries. Okay. So let's say that we are designing a clinical trial. And let's say, okay, you know what, we recognize that cervical is different from thoracic. Okay, we know that. And, okay, we're going to focus now on AIS ABC. And let's say that, okay, you know what, we're going to focus this even more, and we're going to look at the incomplete patients, and we're not going to include that. Okay, so that starts getting pretty narrow. And let's say we plot out what these patients look like at the beginning and their trajectory of outcome. And this is what this looks like. All right? This is 801 patients that are plotted out. And using the INSCI standards, these patients are supposed to be pretty similar. And I would say that this looks like a snowstorm in a Canadian January. All right? So here they are at the beginning. These are the upper extremity motor scores from the INSCI. And so this is one of the outcome measures that is probably of greatest significance to individuals with tetraplegia. This is looking at hand and upper extremity function. That's at the beginning, and that's looking over time. So how on earth do you think that you're really going to be able to detect a signal? But this is what's currently being used in our clinical trials. Okay, that's a problem. So what are some of the solutions? And so, we are in the era now of advanced statistical approaches, and there have been really remarkable advancements that have occurred. So this is one of these approaches. This is a supervised form of machine learning. This is called group-based trajectory modeling. And this is where you recognize the fact that clinical features cluster together. So old people tend to be frail and have lots of medical comorbidities. People who have a certain mechanism of injury will cluster into some other areas. Okay. So let's say we start, trying to do this, and then we want to focus on the outcomes, and then we want to think, okay, can we actually start clustering different clinical features together to map out trajectories? And so what I'm going to present to you is going to be very intuitive. The math here is actually fairly complicated, but the concepts here are simple to understand, and that's also very important. And one of the lessons I learned from one of the senior NACTN statisticians as I was, trying to struggle through our own analysis of the STASCUS data over a decade ago was keep it simple and tone down the statistics, Michael, and present this in a way that people can understand. That was incredibly valuable advice. So we decided to focus on upper extremity motor scores. It's simple, and it's intuitive, and it makes sense, and it's something that individuals who are tetraplegic deal with. And we heard this also from our colleagues with lived experience, and this is something that I've learned. So here's the snowstorm, and then I'll walk you through a table. The table is really busy, but I've tried to simplify it a bit by pointing out a few things in red, and then I'll show you what this looks like kind of pictorially. So, age probably plays a role, right? So an individual who's 25 and who has a cervical cord injury is going to have a different functional outcome than a 65-year-old. So age is important, and you know what? It is important in terms of determining people who have an excellent outcome. The age grade for sure is important. It remains a valid measure, although we criticize its limitations, and it's important. Okay, so that's kind of in the middle. The neurological level is important. So it really does matter what level this is in the cervical area. And as MJ pointed out, you have to be very careful with how you label people, right? A, B, C, it gives you some information, but be very careful with how you label that. And then some of the classic neurological syndromes, central cord syndrome. There's this mythology that somehow the outcomes in central cord syndrome are really great. You know what? It's meaningless. It's very nice, and you can classify this, and you can think you're really smart as a clinical neurologist or neurosurgeon. It's meaningless in terms of the outcome. Oh, and surgery does play a role, and patients who have early surgery are clustered in good and excellent outcomes. Okay, so now we can try to apply some of these features, which are all very intuitive and make sense. And if you actually cluster this, you now have 4 different trajectories. So these patients fall into ones that don't have a very good outcome, and you can pretty much predict that at the beginning. And then some show a moderate degree of recovery, good, and some have an excellent outcome. And this is all of the data, and then these are the means and the 95% confidence intervals. Okay, so this is only looking at a very small number of clinical features that track together. I can tell you we can do a lot better than that. We're now at the stage where we can pretty much predict the outcome of an individual patient with a high degree of accuracy. But this is just looking at 4 things. So you could imagine now, if let's say, you're a clinician trying to say, okay, what's the care pathway going to be of an individual out over the next year? You'd have a pretty good idea what those needs are going to be. And then also, if you're trying to, say you're a clinical trialist and you're trying to figure out, okay, what is my treatment, what's that impact going to be? So rather than trying to throw it into this huge gamish that looks like the snowstorm, you start actually looking on what the trajectories are. So instead of trying to compare apples to watermelons, you're actually trying to get closer to comparing apples to apples. So that becomes really important. And this also relates to function. Okay, so this isn't just some theoretical, statistical playing around. These trajectories correlate with function. So these are some of the trajectories in the functional independence measure, which is also not perfect, but this is how insurance companies determine whether treatments work, okay, in the United States. And this determines funding. And these are pretty important. Can you dress yourself? What's your bowel management? Can you dress yourself, etc. So things are pretty important, and it correlates with this as well. So this correlates with function. And then it turns out that you can actually determine these trajectories by just adding the neurological level and the age to the ASIA scale, and you can determine these temporal profiles. So this was just a very, very simple algorithm, and then from a clinical perspective, you can start making decision trees where you classify people as based on their level of their ASIA impairment, and then their neurological level, and then the age, and you can start getting a better handle on this. And you can do a lot better than this as well, but that kind of involves more advanced kinds of trajectories. Okay, so some of the, I think, conclusions, implications here are that we do have techniques that are available using the existing data sets that are very simple, easy to understand. The math is a bit more complicated, but the principles are simple. And I think this can be used in the clinic to help guide care pathways, and it can also influence the way we design and interpret data from clinical trials. And we've had some publications. This is a publication that came out last year, and we applied this here in the ASIA A population as well. If anybody thinks that ASIA A cervical patients all follow the same trajectory, I got news for you, they don't. And here we were using the similar kinds of approaches, and we could actually determine 3 differing trajectories. And we've done decision tree analyses using machine learning to actually show that about 37% of patients that are labeled as ASIA A cervical do show a significant shift in their ASIA grade. Okay, so that becomes important. All right, and then, a lot of what I've learned has been through this special school, and it's not Harvard or University of Toronto, it's called the School of Hard Knocks. And, I've spent a lot of my life trying to figure out elements of the pathophysiology. And, we were involved really, I think, in the initial development of a concept that's now been called the secondary injury. And we've been trying to study this. And the science is incredibly elegant, and it continues to be very elegant. And I really enjoy interacting with basic scientists. It's really fun interacting with really smart people. Okay, so we had this really great idea that sodium was important, and in the kind introduction was mentioned, that I received the gold medal from the Royal College, and that was actually for the discovery that sodium was involved in a process called excitotoxic white matter injuries. That was my discovery. It's a Journal of Neuroscience publication from the mid-90s. And then I was involved with a company to develop a drug called riluzole. This is a sodium glutamate antagonist, and despite my efforts to try to promote spinal cord injury as the optimal target for the research, they decided to go into ALS, and ALS is super important for sure. I'm not saying SCI is more important, but they didn't do SCI, and what was I going to do? So I was very pleased to have the support from the North American Clinical Trials Network. Robert Grossman was sort of like almost like my surrogate father in terms of supporting this crazy idea. I had to try to repurpose riluzole. So the science was very strong. We had support from the Reeve Foundation, DOD, and AO Spine. we had a positive results in a phase 1/2 study that, and I won't go over all of this because it's a long process. And then we ran a randomized controlled trial, and then we ran into COVID, and the trial ultimately was halted. But we had 193 patients that were enrolled. So it's actually the largest randomized trial in this field. It's been done in about 3 decades. It's pretty big data. And so I'll just give you a snippet. This is actually technically under embargo, but I'm going to cheat and show you one little snippet of data. And so on the left is the primary analysis, and then on the right is a subset analysis. And on the left, these are the means and the 95% confidence intervals. And I like to plot out data this way because it's very simple for you to understand. So the 0 line means it doesn't work, and to the left means that patients don't do as well, and to the right means that patients do better. And if it doesn't touch the 0 line, then it's significant, and if it does, it's not. But it gives you an idea of the consistency of the results. And so on the upper part, those are the upper extremity motor scores. And then the green are the total motor scores. Okay, and so we missed statistical significance. That wasn't a surprise because we had to end the trial early, and we probably were a bit underpowered. But it was interesting. And then we did subset analyses, and this just shows you for the Asia C patients, and we were hit statistical significance. And these were pretty big effect sizes that we saw. And in fact, we saw improvements in the Asia A and the Asia B. But what we also saw was that the way you do the analysis in the Asia A, the Asia B, and the Asia C patients has to be different. And that shouldn't actually be that surprising. The patients are different. Why do you think the same outcome measure is necessarily going to be used? And yet, in clinical trials right now, we have to lump all of the patients together, and I just showed you how foolish that is. And then we're supposed to use one outcome measure that's supposed to measure everybody. That's a problem. And I think we have to, as a field, come around to this, and we probably need to have discussions with FDA around how we design clinical trials and the outcomes. And so I think that we need to actually treat spinal cord injury as an orphan disease. So spinal cord injury is regulated as an orphan disease at the FDA. So if you look at other orphan diseases, for example, pediatric oncology, all the time drugs are approved for these indications based on secondary outcomes. And yet, we're running clinical trials in spinal cord injury the same way that you're running trials of an antihypertensive in the cardiology field where they can enroll 30,000 patients. And there they're looking at one, your primary outcome measure. And so I think that we need to really realistically consider that the trajectories of outcomes for patients with AIS A, B, C, D are different and can be analyzed differently. And rather than trying to narrow down the inclusions, I'm not sure that's the right approach. I think we need to acknowledge that the trajectories are different, and there are very rigorous statistical approaches that can be used in trial design to avoid the criticism that you're doing a statistical fishing expedition, and to actually to measure that. And then I think that we need to really start considering the use of advanced statistical approaches to personalize outcome prediction and to personalize the way that we actually assess the outcomes in clinical trials. I think that a number of the trials that have been done and that have been criticized for missing the mark, including methylprednisolone and Cygen and others, actually had positive signal, which is interesting. So on that note, I'm going to close, and I look forward to some discussion.
So thanks for that. As we situate ourselves, I'm looking forward to the discussion now. So to talk about diving down maybe a little bit more and answering the question, hopefully, of how do we get there. So with that said, what I've been hearing and seeing is a nice consequent of thoughts on the field of endpoints and what's needed. So I'd love to build a bit more perspective now. But before going into more details, I guess a little bit of perspective, have there been any key advancements over the last 3 or 4 years in SCI treatment or even surgeries?
Yeah, so the outcomes now are very different where they were when I was in residency, and I'm constantly having to correct people, including my own students, who make it sound like there's been no advancements that have occurred at all. So when I was in residency, 50% of people with a cervical cord injury died of their injuries. Okay, so it's still a very serious issue, but it's around 5 to 8% die. So we're saving a lot of people's lives. Prevention has helped for sure. Early surgical intervention has made a dramatic impact in the outcomes. There are people that have significantly different outcomes. We're able to lower the levels. There's a much higher rate of lowering the levels, 2 levels or more in a cervical ASIA A. Advances in intensive care, particularly recognition that you have to maintain the blood pressures. And there have been advancements in rehabilitation technologies to enable people to get into the home environment and to live, independent lives. Having said that, we don't have the cure for severe spinal cord injury. Maybe we never will. Maybe the cure isn't the right word to use. We need to be looking at interventions that help. So I think there's been a lot of advancements that have occurred, and I think that needs to be on a positive note. And I think we need to avoid being nihilistic in the outcomes, because I've heard people say, "Well, it's something that can't be treated." I think we're kind of beyond that, but it is true that we lack an effective regenerative treatment. We haven't figured out how to regenerate the lost tissues, and I think that is kind of, one of the big benchmarks that we want to try to seek, and I think it, frankly, is one of the big hopes with stem cell technologies.
Got it. And then, as part of your comments with epidemiology, and I'd love to get MJ's thoughts on this as well, you talked about the trends you're seeing. I'd like to see if you have any more detail, and MJ's too, about, the types of injuries that you've seen that have changed over time. You mentioned age is a big component and other characteristics, and even that impact the occupational side.
Do you want to comment first, MJ?
Well, the trends that we're seeing, more incomplete and cervical level injuries. And, in terms of that comment, and I love people who has lived experience, people will say, "Oh, wow, it's great with more incomplete injuries." Maybe it's great, but incomplete injuries come with their own problems as well, like spasticity and pain. And so, when we classify incomplete and level of injury, yes, we've been seeing different trends. Age, we're now in our mid-40s, where 20 years ago we were in our late 20s, the most common. So yes, we're seeing trends. I will say, and not that it's highly relevant to this, unlike adults with spinal cord injury, when injuries happen in kids, it's entirely a function of age at injury, the outcomes in terms of neurological level, and nothing else.
Yeah, so in just to kind of echo MJ's comments, so in the Riluzole trial that we're just publishing, the average age was 50, the injuries. So and it remains bimodal. The distribution has always been bimodal. So we have a group that very young. Fortunately, pediatric SCI is relatively uncommon, though it occurs. But it used to be, like when I was in training, the most common subgroup of people that you would see would be young men in their 20s. That was the average age. And the most common thing that we're now seeing are middle-aged people. We're seeing a lot more women with injuries. And then we have, it's almost a trimodal distribution now, where the biggest hump is around in the 40s to early 50s. There still is a sizable number of younger people with injuries, and now we're seeing a rising rate in individuals in their 70s and 80s and older, and that's a whole different challenge, because the way you manage, say, an octogenarian with a serious cervical cord injury becomes very different, and that becomes quite challenging as well. So there's a lot of shifts that have occurred. And then in terms of kind of the mechanism of injury, we still see fractures for sure, but many of the fall mechanisms, as I was showing with the case, these are people who have degenerative arthritis in the neck and then have a fall, bump their spinal cord, and have a pretty serious spinal cord injury. And so we're seeing that a lot. And what's been really interesting is that these people are being kind of said, well, that's not a very serious injury because it's incomplete. And as MJ said, be careful what you say there, because spasticity and pain are big issues, and they're actually arguably more of an issue with a severe incomplete injury.
And I think our responses are largely based on North American data, because the trends are different internationally, and so the trends in India, as an example, very different than the trends in North America. So when we start thinking about global clinical trials, the trends do vary as a function of region as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well, and I would echo that. So I would say that the differences now between high income and low and middle income countries have become amplified. The challenge that I find in low and middle income countries is just even to try to have spinal cord injury recognized as an important issue, and to try to have systems of care in place there. And that's a big issue. I'm involved with the WHO consortium right now, just trying to look at the development of systems of care in low and middle income countries. So I guess a lot of what we're referring to now kind of relate to kind of, if I can use the term, first world countries.
Got it. No, thanks for that. And I'm really going to have two core questions, one of which I'm going to leave to the end, but the other one is going to come right now, and it really talks to the unifying theme between both of your presentations, and that's the constant theme that you discussed about heterogeneity with regard to the patient populations, even though they might be defined with the same injury status that you've outlined, as you call it, segmentation, calibration of endpoint items. So with that said, and hopefully this is a broader discussion, what are the key next steps now in treatment, but more importantly to trial design? Like, how do we define next steps?
Yeah, so maybe I'll give a few comments. I mean, I think that like MJ's presentation and my presentation are complementary. So what MJ has shown, and what she's correctly commented on, is that we've been repurposing the INSCI or the Asia assessment to use it in ways that wasn't really designed to be used. And surprise, surprise, it's maybe not that sensitive in terms of assessment of the outcomes. It's kind of, it's valid, but I think we probably need to be kind of rethinking that. And then I think in terms of, and MJ is an authority in this area, and I think in terms of like the trial design, I was one of the first to focus a trial only on cervical. So my Staskas trial and the timing of surgery was focused on cervical, because I recognized that the cervical patients had a different trajectory of outcome than the thoracic, and that was a good decision to do that. But having said that, I am a bit concerned about where the trends are going now to over limit the trial enrollment, and where it's become extremely difficult to enroll patients, and then the generalizability of the results become quite narrow. And I think that, and even within those groups, like cervical Asia 8, like it's an incredibly heterogeneous group. Like that, the variability is almost as significant as what I showed for the incomplete cervical, not quite. And so, you know, there are now ways that we can actually kind of assess that heterogeneity. And if we know, like as clinicians, that the trajectory of outcome of A is different from B, is different from C, then why the heck are we then lumping everybody together and using one outcome measure? And I think we need to start recognizing this. So I think that probably the way that we may want to do this and is, in a sense, it's another step in terms of an adaptive trial design concept. So we learned about adaptive trials where you can take a pause in a trial. You can say, oh, how have we been doing? Oh, we need to do a sample size adjustment, and then you pay a statistical penalty for that, but it's valid to do that. I also think that going forward that maybe we don't limit the enrollment to the same extent, but we recognize that because of the different trajectories of outcome, we may need to select different outcome measures for these different groups, and we define that right up front. But that's going to require a lot of discussions at the FDA level. At the FDA level, you live or die by your primary outcome measure, and all the pharma folks and biotech folks here know that. I'm going to say that's inconsistent with how other orphan conditions are regulated at an FDA level. They don't have that same stringency, say, in pediatric oncology, and I think that's correct, right? Because, you know, you want to try to get treatments coming out. So, okay, we lack an effective regenerative therapeutic in spinal cord injury. Okay, well, let's then put our heads around what have we learned in terms of doing, you know, clinical trials. So we need better outcome measures. Okay, I totally accept that, but I think we need better trial designs.
And just to add to that, I think we have to really be honest with ourselves on, why are we continuing to use some of the existing outcome measures, knowing the severe limitations and how they impact our ability to interpret our results. And so why are we continuing to use them or modify them a little bit? And I know one of the answers, because I've had the conversation, is, well, we have so much data on the skim. I mean, we have tons of data, and if we start with a new assessment, what do we do with all that data? But I would argue we really do have statistical methods and advanced tools to link our outcome measures. So we have all the skim data, and if we create a new assessment and field test it and administer the skim in parallel, we have opportunities to create crosswalks and linkages so that all that data that we've collected over the 20 years isn't necessarily going to waste. But I do think we need to be honest with ourselves about what is stopping us from advancing our ability to measure outcomes when we have the tools at our fingertips.
So just quickly, I mean, I'm hearing potentially, or correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm just trying to stir the pot, potential opposing forces here where, you mentioned, Michael, for example, it could be difficult to enroll a study if the enrollment criteria are just too stringent versus having the algorithms that can identify the trajectories of these patients. So what's helpful and what's potentially opposing?
Well, I think that one of the kind of epiphanies that occurred for me was in a guidelines development group that I led, and it resulted in guidelines that were published in 2017 related to management of acute spinal cord injury. And we followed a process called GRADE. And as part of GRADE, it's strongly recommended to include multidisciplinary, but it's also strongly to include people with lived experience. And so one of my colleagues and friends, and I can publicly use her name because she's gone on record, is Tara Jeji, who is a medical director in the Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation, and she's a high cervical tetraplegic. And we were talking about the interpretation of the data from Bracken's methylprednisolone study, and he was criticized because they showed a 5-point motor point improvement. And so we had a lot of discussions, and we were talking about this at dinner last night. We had a lot of discussions around, well, does this meet the minimum clinically important difference? And it's really hard to say that because it varies a lot. And so we were going back and forth, and then somebody in the group, might have been me, asked Tara JG to comment on this. And she said, are you kidding me? Like, if I could move my finger a little bit more, that would make a world of difference for me, because I can use appliances and I can do this type of stuff. And I said, here you are, you're talking about 5 motor point differences. And you know what? The discussion ended at that point, and basically what it indicated was that this was probably important. So I think one point here is to engage people with lived experience around some of these discussion points, and not just to rely on the scientists and the physicians, because sometimes when we're approaching the FDA, they look at this and they say, well, you know, you've got a lot of skin in the game, and are you really being objective, right? Whereas, and I hope we're trying to be objective, but that's the perception. Whereas I think when you're including people with lived experience, it alters the discussion point around whether this is significant. So this is one of the things that I've learned, and that for me was an epiphany, because having that discussion, and it was hilarious because it just ended the discussion, and everyone in the room became silent, and they were listening to that. So that's, I think, one of the things that we can really learn here. So we're doing this to try to help people to do this, and I think the people that we're trying to help can also help us in terms of trying to advance the field, and also telling us, you know what, Fehlings, you're on the wrong track. Like, that's not so important. This is what's important. Or, you know what, you're on the right track. Or FDA, come on, give me a break. Like, you know, they've got it right. You know, we really do need to consider the heterogeneity, and, you know, and this is a very valid way to do this. And I think this is what's going to be, required. And, you know, I look at, and, you know, today what's being presented, like the science is unbelievably great. Where it's, you know, stem cells and regenerative therapeutics and blocking inhibitory molecules and advanced electrical stimulation techniques and so on and so forth. My fear is that we're going to keep making the same mistakes in terms of the way we've been designing the clinical trials. And I'm speaking from the experience of someone who's done this. So my trial with Riscus was an adaptive design. We limited the enrollment to cervical ABC, multi-center, best sites. Everybody was trained to do the analysis. And you see the results, right? And we ran into the real life situation. So I think we need to learn from this. I think that's very important, and we're at an inflection point.
So learning from this, MJ, I think that's a great segue. You know, even as part of our earlier discussions, a key statement of yours, which I think is pretty powerful, and when you're talking about, is to reevaluate but not recreate models. We don't have to recreate the wheel here. So with that said, what's the low-hanging fruit that can yield positive impacts? I mean, you were talking about, for example, how you streamline performance measures.
Yeah, I think the lowest hanging fruit, which is being done and I think in a very good way, is we are using advanced statistical modeling to evaluate our current outcome measures, to understand how they behave and what the limitations are, so that we're a little bit more careful in the interpretation of our clinical trial data in relationship to the weaknesses of our measures. And I think that's really important. It takes a lot of money and a lot of time to create new, robust, precise measures for human trials. It's not sexy at all to funders at NIH. Like, no one likes to fund a measurement study. So that's the low-hanging fruit. Long term, you know, as we continue with the exciting opportunities in clinical trials, you know, what I think of, not as a clinical trialist really, but really as a measurement person, I'm like, we're spending all this time, all this money, all this effort, and people with spinal cord injuries, time and effort, and our outcome measures are just not where they need to be, but they can be there. And how do we like build the bridge to begin to go there while we're working on the low-hanging fruit?
Great. No, that's perfect. So I guess, you know, even diving a little deeper, you know, what areas can help reevaluate, enhance the current metrics? Because, you know, you mentioned AI or different computer modeling, and even in our earlier discussions, you know, how can advances or more use of imaging help, you know, in advancing these metrics and studies?
Well, I think there are opportunities to use more advanced statistical approaches. And so one is to actually take advantage of the data sets that we have. And so we measure hundreds of data points and we use very few of them. And so there are approaches that you can use where you cluster the data points, and that can be very helpful. So I think that's one opportunity to be used. The imaging is another one for sure. It's more challenging. It takes time and it's costly to do this, but we actually are there now where we actually could do this. So, you know, a few years ago, I was part of a consortium, and this included researchers in Zurich and in London, and this was funded through a number of groups, including REEV and ISRT and WINGS. And so anyway, our challenge was to try to come up with metrics, MRI metrics, and we've come up with them, but I haven't seen them applied now in trials, and we have them. So they're not ideal, they're not perfect, but they do, you know, they help. So we actually are there now where we can use these. I don't know whether they're going to be sensitive enough to detect outcomes. I think we have to be realistic, but I think that they could potentially help us to define at least different trajectories of outcome, and they could potentially be used as a biomarker, perhaps to assess some of the regenerative effects that we're trying to, you know, to see, because, you know, we lack that kind we lack that kind of an outcome. So I think imaging is something that we could actually add now in a very realistic way.
And I guess I'd just like to add some of the advancements in the diffusion tensor imaging and the tractography. Again, for the clinical trials that are examining therapeutics targeting the central nervous system to recover the microstructural functions of the cord, our outcome measures that we assess function, physical functioning with people aren't really targeting that, right? It's a distal measure. But if the imaging can really look at the integrity of the microstructures of the cord, that may provide an opportunity to really assess if we're making an impact at the cord level. And I do think that we're moving towards that direction.
Got it. No, thanks for that. It's a perfect setup. And I think I'm going to jump to my ultimate question here, because we've been circling around it, but haven't addressed it directly. And Michael, you almost got there when you said, you know, we should be treating it like an orphan disease and how we look at, you know, surrogate endpoints, you know, et cetera. So the most important question now is taking these advances that we want to put into clinical trials and what have you, and linking up with the FDA. How do we get there versus what the FDA wants now versus how we can convince them otherwise? And, you know, again, I'm going to quote you, MJ, the FDA wants a lot, but a little can mean so much to patients. And we heard that directly here today, you know, even impacts on quality of life. So I want to open up the FDA discussion with you two, as well as really even open up to the audience once you're done with your commentary, you know, if anyone has ideas about that or wants to ask an additional question.
Yeah, so maybe I'll comment on that. We were just chatting about this a little bit, you know, last night over dinner. So, you know, it's easy to criticize the FDA. I've also had, you know, some my own personal frustrations. But having said that, in general, I mean, I think that they're there to help us. They're here to help the public, and they're to help us. And I think what I have found when I've approached the FDA, and I've done this in a variety of contexts, and asking for advice and showing kind of initial work, and then, like, they're not the experts, so they're actually, they're actually seeking our guidance. And I think that there's an opportunity for us to come collectively. It's hard for when one company does it alone, because it's always viewed, oh, you've got a conflict of interest, you're trying to do this. But if there's a consortium that comes together with some common interests, and particularly if it's associated, let's say, with professionals in the field who are independent, say, of the company, but are serving that, and then also individuals with lived experience who can talk about the importance of some of these issues, I think that there is an opportunity. And I think we're at an inflection point right now in the area of spinal cord injury. And so, do I think that effective treatments are going to be occurring in spinal cord injury? Absolutely. I feel that the scientific advancements that have occurred are remarkable, like absolutely remarkable. It's just, it staggers the mind where we are right now. So I'm extremely hopeful. But we also need to look very realistically at what we have learned and the nature of the condition that we're trying to treat, and what we have learned now over decades of development of outcome measures and doing clinical trials in the most rigorous ways, and say, okay, here are the lessons learned, and we need to come together and we need to start making some recommendations. And my sense will be that the FDA will be open to this, but we have to come together, we have to put our differences aside, and we have to think about what's going to be best for the field. But this is going to be one of these situations that will be truly win-win, because all the companies will benefit from this, the public will benefit from this, the patients will benefit from this. So I think that's what we need to do.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add. I do think we need to come together as one and be stronger.
No, that's fantastic. I mean, I see a very important convergence with being able to take our discussion today and what you've been working on with regard to endpoints and clinical trial design, as well as what we're going to hear later today with regard to some of the companies presenting, and merge the two very nicely. So I wanted to see if anyone wanted to comment on the FDA. I won't call it an issue, but working with them and getting them on board with regard to getting this more of an orphan disease and looking at quality of life and other surrogate endpoints, or even an additional question for the panel. Yes.
MJ, I told you I couldn't keep my mouth shut.
No, do you want this?
Yeah, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, clarity, technically, spinal cord injury is not an orphan disease according to FDA, and I'm happy to talk to you after that, because I've already argued that comment with them. When we speak to FDA, which we had an info meeting earlier this month, they hear variability across neurological conditions. So we have to make a case why and how we do measure variability in spinal cord injuries specifically. And I think if we have to think collaboratively, not just FDA, but for the players that are in the room, we have to start thinking about reimbursement. Because in the industry side of things, approval is great, but cash flow is king. And so we have to look at those two issues together rather than separately. And I think we have to really start to explore the opportunity of working with FDA in collaborative communities. They already have about a dozen or so of them out there right now. And if we can find common ground in industry, we can potentially build a collaborative community for spinal cord injury.
I would agree with most of what you've said, but I'll give you a specific example. So, FDA has not considered spinal cord injury as an orphan disease as a whole. I agree with you on that. The challenge is that they look at it from treatment to treatment, and it also depends on who's advocating. So when I was helping Lisa McCarricker move her technology forward through bioaxal and C3 Rho inhibitor, that strategy was deemed to have orphan disease status, all right? And you need strong advocates, and you need strong science, and we really made the strong push there. and we need to come together collectively as a group. But there is precedent where, for certain indications, they have considered orphan disease status, and that has a very important implications, as I'm sure everyone in the audience is aware, in terms of the level of trials, right? So if it's not orphan disease status, you need several randomized controlled trials in order to get an on-label indication. And with an orphan disease status, so if Lisa's trial would have been positive, and it wasn't, but if it would have been positive, then they would have had an on-label indication with one trial, and that's what we need to kind of to do. So you're correct technically, but I was kind of speaking, I guess, maybe from my own experience with that. But we need to come together, I think, as a group here, and I think FDA would be open to that guidance, because my own experience in dealing with them has actually been quite positive. I've actually found them to be quite receptive to this.
So actually, I don't want to be living with the stigma of getting us off schedule. So I do want to thank the organizers, and especially Michael and MJ, for participating in this. I know there's going to be great discussions over lunch as well. So thank you very much.